In the spring of 2014, I was 28 years old, and my car wouldn't start in a strip mall parking lot in Charlotte, North Carolina. The starter motor had died. The mechanic told me he could get me a new one for around $1,800, and that he'd need a deposit before he could order the part. 6 months earlier, the same phone call would have ruined my week. I would have started rearranging my budget. I'd have called my mother. I'd have weighed whether I could get to work on the bus, fought with the mechanic about whether the diagnosis was real or whether I was being upsold, and pulled out my credit card with a sick feeling in my stomach, knowing the $1,800 would sit on the balance for at least 3 months while the interest piled up. But the phone call in that parking lot didn't feel that way. I told the guy to go ahead with the repair. I took an Uber home and read a book that night. The next morning, the car was fixed, and I paid the bill from my checking account, and the whole thing was over before lunch. Nothing about the situation had changed from 6 months earlier, except one number. The number was $20,000, sitting in a savings account I'd spent about 2 years building. I'd crossed $20,000 for the first time around 10 weeks before the car broke down. There hadn't been any celebration. There wasn't even a real moment of recognition. I just looked at the balance one Friday afternoon and thought, that's a round number, and went back to my life. What I didn't understand yet is that crossing $20,000 in cash savings was the single biggest financial event of my 20s. It wasn't crossing 6 figures invested, buying my first house, or the raise I got 2 years later when I switched companies. The biggest event was a boring round number, sitting in a savings account doing essentially nothing. Because that number quietly changed the kind of person I was in every financial situation that followed. This video is about why. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that actually works for normal people, instead of the kind that gets you to click on a thumbnail. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. The version of this argument you've probably already heard is the standard emergency fund message. That version is technically true, but practically useless, because it doesn't tell you why 20,000 specifically changes the math in ways that 10,000 doesn't, or what actually happens to your decisions on the other side of the line. I'm going to walk through 8 things that quietly flipped for me after I crossed 20,000. And what current data says about why this number specifically matters more than the financial advice industry tends to admit. Let's get into it. 1. The day your bank account stops being a timing problem. Before 20,000, money is a timing problem. Every bill has to clear after every paycheck. Rent has to be due after the 15th, not before. A doctor's appointment that generates a surprise copay in the same week as a credit card minimum payment is a small crisis. You learn, without ever being taught, to live inside a calendar of when money arrives and when money leaves, and you make 100 tiny adjustments a month to keep those two flows from crossing the wrong way. Above 20,000, that calendar disappears. You stop thinking about which day is the 15th and which day is the 22nd. Your checking account is no longer the load-bearing wall of your financial life. The savings account behind it absorbs the variation, and the variation just stops mattering. Per Federal Reserve data released in May 2025, about 37% of American adults could not cover a $400 emergency expense exclusively with cash on hand. Roughly half of all adults could not cover a $2,000 expense from savings. Those numbers tell you exactly how many people are running their entire financial life on the timing of paychecks. It's most people. It's structurally the default state of being middle class in America, not the exception. The mental load of paycheck timing is real, and it's exhausting in a way you don't fully feel until it's gone. Tracking which bills hit on which dates, mentally projecting the balance forward 2 weeks, holding your breath every time a recurring charge comes through that you'd forgotten about. All of that runs in the background of your brain for years. The first thing 20,000 buys you isn't safety. It's the quiet. The constant low-level calculation just stops, and your brain gets a piece of itself back that it didn't know it had been giving away. 2. The what if calculator in your head shuts off. Before 20,000, you run worst case scenarios constantly without realizing you're doing it. What if the car breaks down, or you lose your job, or the dog needs surgery, or the apartment floods? Most of those scenarios never happen, and the ones that do happen are almost never as bad as the version your brain rehearsed. But the rehearsal itself has a cost. It's a tax your nervous system pays on every uncertain thing in your future. The shift at 20,000 is that those scenarios stop being catastrophic and become inconvenient. A blown transmission used to be the end of your financial year. Now it's a Saturday afternoon and a wire transfer. The dog needing surgery used to mean a payment plan. Now it means a vet bill. The hot water heater dying used to mean 3 weeks of stress. Now it means picking a contractor. The data on this is sharper than you might expect. Per the Federal Reserve's 2024 household survey, 55% of adults said they had rainy day savings sufficient to cover 3 months of expenses. That sounds like a majority. It is. But 45% did not, which means almost half the country is one significant surprise away from carrying credit card debt for a year or more. And the surprises don't space themselves out politely. Per Bankrate's February 2025 Emergency Savings Survey, about half of Americans who tapped their emergency savings in the past year did so for a genuine unplanned expense, like a medical bill or car repair. And over a fifth pulled from savings to help a family member or pay down debt. The surprises cluster. 20,000 pre-funds the next several surprises. It doesn't make them not happen. It makes them not matter. And once they don't matter, you stop spending mental cycles rehearsing them. The what if calculator that's been running since you became financially aware finally goes quiet. 3. Your insurance deductibles become a strategy instead of a gamble. Most people pick the lowest deductible their insurance company offers because the alternative feels scary. Auto, home, renters, even health when there's a choice. The instinct is to minimize the dollar amount they'd have to pay if something went wrong, which sounds prudent until you do the math on what the lower deductible actually costs. Switching from a $500 auto deductible to a $1,000 deductible typically saves between 15 and 20% on the collision premium. Switching from a $1,000 home insurance deductible to a $2,500 or $5,000 deductible typically saves between 15 and 30% on the homeowner's premium. On a typical American household paying somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a year in combined home and auto premiums, choosing the higher deductibles across the board can save $500 to $900 annually, per year, every year, for as long as you carry insurance. The reason most people don't do this is that below $20,000, you genuinely can't afford a $5,000 deductible. If your house gets hit by a hailstorm and the deductible eats your savings, you're back to square one. So the higher deductible math doesn't work for you, even though it's economically rational for the long run. Above $20,000, the math reverses. You can self-insure the smaller losses because you have the cash to absorb them. The premium savings flow straight into your savings account, where they compound. Over a 30-year insurance-paying adulthood, choosing the right deductible structure once you can afford to is worth somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 in cumulative savings. It's a quiet six-figure swing across an insurance lifetime when you compound the savings at modest returns. The first decision unlocks the second, and almost nobody talks about this because the insurance industry has no incentive to point it out. 4. You stop optimizing the wrong end of your budget. Below $20,000, every small purchase feels meaningful because every dollar feels meaningful. You skip the $4 coffee, compare gas prices across 2 stations, and hesitate over a $15 lunch. The behavior makes intuitive sense because you can see the dollars leaving and you feel the friction of each one. Above $20,000, the small purchases lose their grip on your attention, and the big decisions start to come into focus. The $4 coffee adds up to maybe $1,000 a year if you buy one every workday. The wrong choice of insurance plan, the wrong job, the wrong neighborhood to buy in, the wrong 401k allocation, the wrong car loan term, each of those can cost 10 to 50 times more than the entire coffee budget for a decade. What shifts at 20,000 is that your optimization moves from the small things you can see to the big things you usually can't. A worker who spends 2 hours a week thinking about whether to brown bag lunch, but signs a 6% car loan when they could have gotten 3, is mathematically misallocating their attention by a factor of about 100. Below 20,000, you can't afford to think that way, because the small leaks really do sink the boat. Above 20,000, the small leaks become rounding errors, and the brain capacity that used to run the coffee math gets redirected to the decisions that actually move your wealth. This shift in attention is one of the most underrated returns on having savings. It's not that small purchases stop mattering in some absolute sense. It's that the highest and best use of your decision-making bandwidth changes. The people I know who built real wealth all crossed this line at some point, and almost none of them remember when. 5. You can take the slow job search. Per Bureau of Labor Statistics data from earlier this year, the median duration of unemployment in the United States is roughly 10 weeks. The average is closer to 23 weeks. The difference between those two numbers tells you that most job searches resolve quickly, but a long tail of them stretch out for 6 months or longer, especially for higher paying professional roles, where the average for management and business occupations runs over 5 months. Below 20,000, those numbers force a behavior. You can't wait 10 weeks for the right job, let alone 23. You take the first reasonable offer because your savings won't cover the search, and you accept worse pay, worse benefits, worse fit, worse commute. The salary difference between the first offer you'd accept under pressure and the third or fourth offer you'd take if you weren't desperate is typically somewhere between 10 and 20%. On a $60,000 job, that's $6,000 to $12,000 a year of difference every year that compounds into raises and bonuses for the rest of your career. Above 20,000, those weeks become available to you. 10 weeks of expenses for a typical household is somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000. 20,000 covers the median job search with margin and gives you part of the buffer for a longer one. That means you can hold out for the offer that's actually right, not the first one that lands. The career math on this is huge and almost never gets talked about. A single 10% salary increase at age 30, compounded through normal raises over the next 30 years, is worth somewhere around $300,000 of lifetime earnings. $20,000 of cash savings paid for one negotiation, which paid for the next 3 decades. The leverage ratio is staggering, and it only exists if you have the cushion to use it. 6. Rent, security deposits, and moving stop dictating where you live. There's a hidden tax on being broke that almost nobody calculates, and it's the cost of being stuck in the wrong housing. Moving costs money. First month, last month, security deposit, movers, utility deposits, the overlap of 2 leases for the awkward weekend between them. For a typical American adult moving to a modestly nicer place, the upfront cost is somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000, even before you've spent the first dollar of new rent. Below $20,000, that upfront cost stops you from moving even when moving would save you money. You stay in the apartment that's 20 minutes from work because the closer one needs a deposit you can't float. And you stay in the neighborhood that's not great for your kids because the better one would require fronting $2,000 more you don't have. Rent increases that you could have escaped by moving get accepted because the move itself is more expensive than the increase. You're trapped by friction. Above $20,000, that friction goes away. moving becomes a strategic decision instead of a financial impossibility. The right move can save you $200 to $400 a month in rent, which is $2,400 to $4,800 a year, which is the equivalent of a small raise. Or, the right move can put you closer to a better job, which can be worth far more than that. There's also a less visible version of this, which is the version where you stay in a job because the geography traps you. The job's not great, but you can't move closer to a better one because moving is $6,000 you don't have. The cushion is what gives you back the ability to move when moving is the right answer, instead of staying because staying is the cheaper bad option. 7. Marketing stops working on you the same way. A surprising thing happens to your psychology at 20,000, and it's that you stop being susceptible to the entire category of marketing built around urgency. Limited time offer. Today only. Only 3 left at this price. Special financing if you sign today. These tactics work on people who are stressed about money, because stress narrows your time horizon and makes save $500 right now feel more important than lose $2,000 over the next 4 years. Above $20,000, you have time. You can sleep on a purchase. You can wait until the end of the month, or the end of the quarter, or the next sale, or never. The clock that the salesperson is trying to start in your head doesn't start. This shows up most clearly at car dealerships, mattress stores, jewelry counters, and anywhere that sells through a financing arrangement. The whole architecture of those sales is designed to compress your decision time and pair it with a financing offer that looks reasonable in isolation, but is structurally unfavorable. A 6-year auto loan at 7% on a $40,000 car, which is roughly the current average new car loan rate per Bankrate's weekly survey, will extract about $9,000 in interest over the life of the loan, before you account for the fact that they could have bought a cheaper car if they hadn't been moved into a larger one by the financing being available. The buy now, pay later industry runs on the same principle. Per LendingTree's 2025 survey, 41% of buy now, pay later users paid late on at least one loan in the past year, up from 34% the year before. Per the CFPB's December 2025 market report, the average user takes more than 6 BNPL loans per provider per year, with a meaningful share holding multiple simultaneous loans across different apps. The offer is constructed to look like zero cost, and then quietly isn't, once the late fees and the overdraft fees triggered by missed auto debits start stacking up. Customers with real savings rarely use these products. The moment you can pay cash, the entire category goes invisible. 8. Investing finally starts working for you instead of against you. The 8th thing, and probably the most important one for the long run, is that $20,000 in cash is the prerequisite for actually being able to invest. Not in the legal sense. Anybody with a few $100s can open a brokerage account. In the practical sense, where you put money into volatile assets and let them do their thing without panicking out at the worst possible moment. The reason is that investments only work if you can leave them alone. The historical 7% real return on broad market index funds isn't an average that gets delivered to you smoothly. It comes with 30 and 40% drawdowns at intervals, lasting 12 to 30 months each. If you have to liquidate your investments in the middle of one of those drawdowns because your transmission blew up and you don't have the cash to cover it, the 7% average doesn't apply to you. You sold at the bottom and locked in the loss. The tax of selling at the wrong moment, which on a modest portfolio can be the difference between a comfortable retirement and a delayed one, just got paid. The most common pattern in retail investing is people putting money into the market before they have an emergency fund, then being forced to sell in the next downturn when something goes wrong. Per Morningstar's Mind the Gap research released in August 2025, real investor performance trails the funds investors actually own by roughly 1.2 percentage points a year, and that gap has been persistent across the past decade. Almost all of it comes from this exact behavior, the selling at the wrong moment. Over a 20-year investing horizon, even a 1.2% annual gap compounds into well over $100,000 of missed wealth on a middle-class portfolio. That's the cost of investing without a cushion first. The right sequence is the opposite of what most people do. Build the $20,000 in cash, then start investing aggressively, and never touch the cash unless something actually requires it. The cash is what makes the investing work. Without it, you're just paying the market a tuition fee for lessons in not selling at the bottom. So those are the 8. The timing problem disappears, the what-if calculator shuts off, your insurance deductibles become a strategy, you stop optimizing the wrong end of the budget, you can take the slow job search, housing stops trapping you, marketing loses its grip, and investing finally starts working for you. The number itself isn't sacred. For someone living in a low-cost area with modest expenses, the line might cross at $15,000. For someone with a family and a mortgage in a high-cost city, it might be closer to $30,000. The point isn't $20,000 exactly. The point is that there's a threshold somewhere in this range where the math of your financial life flips, and the behaviors that worked below it stop working, and a different set of behaviors becomes possible. A neighbor of mine named Paul, who retired a few years back and now spends his afternoons in a Subaru covered in dog hair, told me something at a barbecue once that I didn't understand at the time. He said the actual secret to having money wasn't earning more. It was getting to the point where you stopped having to think about money every day. I was probably 30 when he said it, and I nodded politely the way you do when somebody older says something that sounds like a fortune cookie. It took me another 5 or 6 years to realize he'd handed me the entire thesis of personal finance in 2 sentences, and that the threshold he was describing was exactly the one I'd crossed in that parking lot in Charlotte without recognizing it for what it was. If you're below $20,000 right now, the goal isn't to feel bad about it. The goal is to understand that the line exists and that crossing it changes more than the balance in the account. If you're above $20,000 and you're still operating like you're below it, the goal is to notice that the behaviors that got you here are no longer the highest use of your attention, and that the next version of you is allowed to make decisions differently. Drop a comment with which of the 8 hit closest to home, or with the one you're still doing even though you don't have to. I read every comment, and if you want me to walk through what happens at the next threshold, which is somewhere around 100,000 and is its own conversation with its own math, hit subscribe. That's the next video. I'll see you in the next one.